There are things a person carries so long they become part of the body, not a memory anymore, but something closer to bone. I have carried this particular weight since the autumn of 1851, when I was 18 years old and the world I knew proved itself far stranger and far crueler than any sermon had prepared me for. My name is Eleanor Marsh. I was born in the hill country of western Pennsylvania, in a farmhouse that no longer stands, to parents who no longer breathe. I am past 80 now, 82, if my mother's record in the family Bible can be trusted, and I have no reason to doubt her handwriting. My eyes have grown weak. My hands shake when the cold comes in under the door. But my memory of that autumn, of those particular weeks, has never once blurred. Some things the mind refuses to release. This is one of them. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I'm not a woman given to fancy. I never was. My father raised me to trust what I could touch, weigh, and measure. He had no patience for ghost stories or superstition, and neither did I. What I'm about to tell you is not a ghost story. I want to be clear about that from the very first breath. What happened to the village of Millhaven in October of 1851 has an explanation, a human explanation, imperfect and incomplete, but human. The horror of it is not that it defies understanding. The horror is that once you do understand it, even partially, you wish you had been left in ignorance. I've not spoken about this publicly in over 40 years. There were reasons for the silence, reasons I will explain as we go. But I am old enough now to know that silence has its own consequences. Things buried without a marker have a way of staying buried. And this particular thing deserves a marker, even a modest one, even this late. So let me begin where all honest accounts must begin, with the place itself, and with the people who once filled it. Millhaven was not a large settlement at its peak, and its peak was not long before its end. It held perhaps 130 souls. It sat in a folded valley about 4 miles northeast of the town of Garrett's Crossing, tucked between two long ridges of second-growth timber and a creek called Sallow Run that ran copper-colored in the dry months. You would not find it on most maps even then. It was the kind of place that existed more in the knowledge of its neighbors than in any official record. My family's farm sat on higher ground to the southwest. On clear mornings, if you climbed to our upper pasture fence, you could see the smoke from Millhaven's chimneys rising in thin columns above the tree line. In winter, when the leaves were down, you could sometimes make out the pale shape of the mill that gave the place its name, a grist mill on Sallow Run, built sometime in the 1830s by a man named Corvin Hale, whose family had anchored the settlement from its earliest days. I knew Millhaven the way a child knows a neighboring town, through occasional visits, through faces seen at the Garrett's Crossing market on Saturdays, through names mentioned at the dinner table. My mother bought cornmeal from the Hale mill twice a year. My father had disputes, minor ones, with a Millhaven farmer named Duggan over a boundary line. I had a girlhood friendship, loose and intermittent, with a girl named Priscilla Ames, whose family kept a small dry goods counter near the mill road. She had red hair and a laugh that you could hear from 3 houses away. I mention her because she matters to what comes later. I mention her because she was one of the 130, and because I never saw her again after the 9th of October, 1851. That date is not a guess. I am certain of it because I had written it in my own journal the evening before, a journal I kept sporadically through my adolescence, more a record of weather and chores than any true diary. The entry for the 8th of October reads, in my own girlish hand, clear and cold. Father pulled the last of the squash, smoke heavy from the valley again tonight. And then on the 9th, a single line that I have read perhaps 1,000 times since. Something is wrong across the ridge. No smoke this morning. No bells. That was how it began for me. Not with violence or spectacle, with absence, with a silence that had no right to be there. Millhaven was not the kind of place that drew attention to itself. That was perhaps its defining quality, a quietness that felt earned rather than accidental, the quietness of people who had decided, collectively and without discussion, that the best life was one conducted without fanfare. I want you to see it as I saw it, because you cannot understand what was lost without first understanding what existed. The village followed a single main road, unpaved and rutted, that ran roughly east to west along the lower slope of the northern ridge. On either side of this road, set back at irregular intervals, stood perhaps 25 or 30 structures. Houses mostly, a few of them substantial, most of them modest, all of them built from the same pale limestone that the ridge provided in abundance. The stone gave Millhaven a particular color in certain lights, especially in late afternoon when the sun came low over the western gap. The whole settlement would go the color of old cream, warm and solid looking, and the smoke from the chimneys would turn gold against the darkening sky behind it. The hail mill anchored the eastern end of the road. It was a working mill, grinding corn and wheat for the surrounding farms, and its wheel turned whenever the creek ran full enough, which in spring and early autumn was nearly every day. The sound of it carried up the valley on still mornings, a low rhythmic churning that the people of Millhaven lived with so constantly they no longer heard it. Visitors noticed it. Residents had long since folded it into the background of existence, the way a man forgets the ticking of a clock he has owned for 20 years. The Hale family itself was the oldest in the settlement. Old Corvin Hale had died some years before the events I am describing, but his son Nathaniel ran the mill with the same methodical competence his father had shown. Nathaniel was perhaps 45 at the time, a lean, careful man with very little humor but considerable fairness. People trusted him with their grain and their money, and sometimes their disagreements, which is about as much trust as a farming community extends to anyone. Beyond the Hales, Millhaven held the usual mixture of families that a small Pennsylvania settlement would accumulate over 2 decades of gradual growth. There were the Dugan brothers, 3 of them, who farmed the bottomland along Sallow Run with more stubbornness than skill, but produced a reliable rye crop. There was a widow named Mrs. Fetter, who kept bees and sold honey at the Saturday market in jars she sealed with wax and labeled in a surprisingly elegant hand. There was a school teacher, a young man from Philadelphia named Reese, who had arrived 2 years earlier and stayed, as outsiders sometimes do, longer than they originally intended. And there was the Ames family, keepers of the dry goods counter, with their red-haired daughter Priscilla, whom I have already mentioned. Her father, Thomas Ames, was a practical and talkative man who seemed to know everything that passed through the valley, partly because everything that passed through the valley eventually needed something from his shelves: salt, lamp oil, thread, nails, patent medicines of doubtful virtue. Ames stocked them all and remembered who had bought what and when. My mother liked him. My father found him exhausting. I found him fascinating, in the way that a quiet child is fascinated by people who fill a room without apparent effort. This was Millhaven in the months and weeks before October of 1851, a working, breathing, ordinary place. Children walked to the schoolroom in the mornings. Women hung washing on lines between the limestone houses. Men argued about weather and prices and the right way to mend a fence. On Sunday mornings, the small Methodist chapel at the western end of the road filled with voices that you could hear faintly from the upper pasture of our farm if the wind was right. I want you to hold that image, those voices, that sound crossing 4 miles of autumn air, because in a matter of weeks it would be gone, not faded, not diminished, gone, and the absence would be so complete, so abrupt, that the people who knew Millhaven would spend the rest of their lives pressing their memories of it like dried flowers between the pages of what they thought they understood about the world. The last time I saw Priscilla Ames was at the Garrett's Crossing Market on the first Saturday of October. She bought a spool of blue thread from a vendor 2 stalls down from where my mother was selling preserves. She caught my eye and waved, and I waved back, and that was all. 8 days later, she had vanished along with every other soul in that valley. 8 days. I have measured that gap 10,000 times since. The week before it happened was ordinary in almost every way. I want to be precise about that because in the years since, people have had a tendency to reach backward and find omens, to say that the weather was strange, or that the animals were restless, or that someone dreamed something significant. Memory does that. It rearranges itself around the event, makes everything before it point toward the ending like arrows on a road. I've tried my whole life to resist that tendency, and I will resist it here. The weather that first week of October was cold and clear, the kind of autumn weather that western Pennsylvania produces when it's at its most honest. Sharp mornings, bright afternoons, the smell of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and the particular sweetness of apples left too long on the ground. My father and I were finishing the harvest. We worked from before sunrise until the light failed, and in the evenings, I was too tired for much beyond eating and sitting near the fire for a short while before sleep took me. On the evening of the 7th of October, which was a Tuesday, I was at the upper pasture fence just before dusk, bringing in 2 of the milk cows that had drifted toward the far corner. From that fence line, I had my usual view of the valley below, the dark line of the ridge timber, the pale thread of the sallow run corridor, and just visible above the tree line, the chimney smoke of Millhaven rising in the cooling air. I remember standing there for a moment longer than necessary, watching it, not because anything seemed wrong, simply because the evening was beautiful and I was 18 and occasionally prone to standing still and looking at things without purpose. The smoke was normal. The valley was quiet. A crow called somewhere in the timber to the east and then stopped. I turned and brought the cows in. On the evening of the 8th, the last entry in my journal before the silence, my father mentioned at supper that he had spoken that afternoon with a neighbor named Caleb Storch, whose farm sat closer to the Millhaven road than ours. Storch had said, apparently in passing, that there had been some kind of disagreement in the village the previous week. He did not know the details. Something involving Nathaniel Hale and one of the Duggan brothers, a dispute that had apparently grown louder than disputes in Millhaven usually did. My father shrugged when he told us this. Villages have their quarrels, he said. It amounts to nothing, usually. My mother asked no questions. I asked no questions. We finished supper, and the evening passed as evenings passed. What I did not know, what none of us on the surrounding farms knew until much later, was that the disagreement my father had mentioned so casually was not a simple boundary dispute or a question of unpaid debt. It was something older and more tangled than that, something that had been building in Millhaven for the better part of 2 years, quietly and out of sight, the way a rot builds inside a timber wall that still looks solid from the outside. I did not know any of that on the evening of the 8th. I went to bed when the fire burned low, and I slept without dreams. And in the morning I rose before light, as I always did, and went to the window to check the sky for weather. The sky was clear. The stars were still out in the west. And when I turned my eyes toward the valley, toward the dark silhouette of the far ridge, I saw nothing. No smoke. Not a thread of it. Not from any direction along the Millhaven corridor. I stood at that window for a long time, waiting for the light to grow, and for the first chimney fires of the morning to appear above the tree line the way they always did. They did not appear. I told myself it was too early. I dressed and went down to begin the morning work, and I kept finding reasons to step outside and look southeast, and each time the sky above the ridge was empty and pale and unmarked. By the time my father came in for his breakfast, I had already said it aloud once to myself, standing alone in the yard with my breath clouding in the cold air. Something is wrong across the ridge. I wrote it in my journal that morning. Then I put the journal away and said nothing to my parents, because I could not yet explain what I was afraid of. I only knew that a valley where 130 people lived did not produce no smoke on a cold October morning, not unless something had gone very wrong indeed. By mid-morning, my father had noticed it too. He came in from the barn with a particular look on his face, not alarm exactly, but the careful stillness of a man who has registered something wrong and is deciding how seriously to take it. He poured himself coffee and stood at the kitchen window for a moment without speaking. Then he said quietly that he was going to ride over to Caleb Storch's place and see what Storch knew. He was gone for 2 hours. When he came back, his face had changed. Storch had already been down the Millhaven road that morning, early, before my father arrived. He had gone only as far as the edge of the settlement, to the point where the road curved around the last stand of oak timber and the first of the limestone houses came into view. He had not gone further. He had turned his horse around and ridden back at a pace that was not quite a gallop, but was close enough to one that his wife had come out of the house when she heard him coming. What he had seen, he told my father, was simply an empty village, no movement, no animals in the yards, no washing on the lines, no tools leaning against walls, no children, nothing that indicated ordinary morning life in a place where 130 people were supposed to be waking up and beginning their day. The houses stood, the mill stood, the chapel at the western end of the road stood. Everything built of stone and timber remained exactly as it had always been, but the life inside those structures, the human pulse of the place, was absent. My father told us this at the kitchen table, and my mother sat very still while he spoke. And when he finished, she asked the question I had been afraid to ask myself. Were any of the doors open? My father said he would have to ask Storch more carefully. He had not thought to ask that particular question. But he was going back, he said, not alone this time. He was going to gather 2 or 3 of the neighboring men and go into the village properly, on foot, and find out what there was to find. He looked at me when he said this and told me I was to stay at the farm with my mother. His tone left no room for argument, and I did not argue, though I wanted to badly. He left again within the hour. He took Caleb Storch and a farmer named Aldous Vane, who lived half a mile north of us and was known for being steady in difficult situations. The 3 of them walked into Millhaven on foot, leaving their horses at the timber's edge. They were gone for most of the afternoon. When my father returned the second time, he did not speak immediately. He sat down at the table and accepted the coffee my mother put in front of him and held the cup with both hands for a long moment. Then he described what they had found, and I will tell you his account as faithfully as I can, because I have turned it over in my mind for more than 60 years, and every detail of it has stayed precise and undiminished. The village was empty in a way that defied immediate explanation, not abandoned in the sense that word usually implies, not stripped bare, not ransacked, not showing the signs of a departure that had been planned and executed over days or weeks. The houses were full, furniture in place, dishes on shelves, clothing hanging on pegs beside doors. In the Ames dry goods counter, the morning's accounts were open on the desk beside the till, a pen resting across the ledger, as though Thomas Ames had set it down for a moment and intended to return. In 2 of the houses, fires had been laid in the hearths but not lit, the kindling arranged, the tinder ready, as if the person who had done it had been interrupted before striking the flint. In the Hale household, breakfast had been prepared and not eaten. The food was cold and had been cold for many hours, but it was there. Bread, a pot of cooked grain, a jug of milk that had begun to turn. 3 chairs were pulled out from the table. 3 plates were set. The mill wheel had stopped turning, not because anything had broken, but because someone had engaged the brake mechanism that halted it, a deliberate action, requiring a person to be present and to choose to do it. Whoever had stopped the wheel had done so intentionally, and then had gone away and not come back. My father said the silence inside the village was the worst part, not the emptiness of the houses or the cold food or the pen resting across the open ledger. The silence. Because a stone village on a cold morning should have sounds even when no people are moving. The creak of timbers contracting, the noise of any animals left behind, the mill wheel or the creak or the wind through an unlatched shutter. But Millhaven that afternoon was quiet in a way that felt almost enforced, as if the silence itself were something that had been deliberately arranged. They found no signs of fire, no signs of flood. The creek was running at its normal autumn level. No signs of violence in any of the houses they entered. No broken furniture, no disturbed floors, no indication that anyone had left in fear or in haste. The only thing that seemed genuinely absent, beyond the people themselves, was any significant quantity of food or clothing, not stripped bare, but reduced, as if each household had taken what a person could reasonably carry. That detail is the one my father returned to again and again in the days that followed. They took what they could carry, he said. That means they left on their own feet. That means they chose to go. But where? And why? And why all of them, all at once, on a night so cold that the ground had been hard with frost when Storch rode down the road that morning? Those questions had no answers on the 9th of October. They would take weeks to begin to take shape, and even then the shape they took was not a clean one. Word travels fast in farming country, faster than any newspaper and considerably faster than any official messenger. By the following morning, the 10th of October, there were men from 4 surrounding farms gathered at the edge of the Millhaven road, and by noon that number had grown to something closer to 15. My father was among them again, Caleb Storch, Aldous Vane. Several men I recognized from the Garrett's Crossing Market, and several I did not know by name. They organized themselves with the practical efficiency of people who are accustomed to working together in emergencies. Harvests lost to sudden weather, barns brought down by fire. And they divided into smaller groups and went through Millhaven methodically, house by house, building by building, covering the ground that my father and his 2 companions had only partially covered the day before. I know what they found because my father told me, and because Aldous Vane's wife, a sharp and precise woman named Harriet, compared notes with my mother over the following weeks, and between the 2 of them, they assembled a picture that was more complete than any single account. I also know because 3 days after the search, I went myself. I will come to that. The full search of Millhaven took the better part of 2 days. There were 23 residential structures, the mill, the chapel, the Ames counter, a small smithy at the eastern end of the road near the mill, and a handful of outbuildings and storage sheds. Every one of them was entered and examined. The men worked carefully, and to their credit, without disturbing more than was necessary. My father said afterward that there was an unspoken understanding among the searchers that whatever had happened here was not yet understood, and that the place ought to be treated accordingly, not touched carelessly, not stripped or looted, left as close to its found condition as possible. What the full search confirmed, and what the partial search the day before had only suggested, was this: the departure had been orderly, not panicked, not forced, not the result of any sudden catastrophe that the physical evidence could account for. Every fireplace had been cleaned of its current fire before the inhabitants left, the coals raked out, the ash scattered or removed. This was not the behavior of people fleeing. This was the behavior of people who intended to leave and did not want to leave a fire burning behind them in an empty house. Similarly, the livestock, what little Millhaven kept, mostly chickens and a few pigs, had been released from their enclosures rather than abandoned inside them. The enclosure gates and the chicken house doors were standing open. The animals had scattered into the surrounding fields and timber, and the search party spent a portion of their time simply moving around confused chickens that had no idea what to do with their unexpected freedom. The schoolroom, which sat just behind the chapel, held the detail that stayed with me longest when I heard it. The slates were clean, All of them, perhaps 18 or 20 student slates, stacked neatly on the shelf along the back wall where the children left them at the end of each school day. Whatever lesson had last been written on those slates had been wiped away. My father said that when Reese, the young Philadelphia school teacher, had last held class, which by their best reckoning was the 7th of October, 2 days before the disappearance, the children would have left their slates with that day's work still on them, because that was the usual practice. Reese was known to review the work the following morning before the students arrived. But the slates were clean. Someone had wiped them. Someone had made a point of it. That detail disturbed the searchers more than almost anything else, and I think I understand why. A cleaned fireplace is practical, a precaution against fire in an empty house. Released livestock is a small mercy. You don't leave animals penned with no one to feed them. But clean slates serve no practical purpose. They erase nothing of consequence. They accomplish nothing beyond erasure itself. And that suggests something deliberate and strange about the state of mind of whoever did it. A desire not just to leave, but to leave no trace of what had been there. Even the small, ordinary traces. Even a child's arithmetic on a school slate. On the third day after the discovery, as I said, I went myself. My father did not know until I was already gone. I rose before him and walked the 4 miles to Millhaven alone in the early morning, arriving as the light was coming gray and flat over the eastern ridge. I had told myself I wanted to see Priscilla's house, Thomas Ames's counter. I wanted to see for myself, rather than through my father's careful and edited account. The village was exactly as described, and also nothing like I had expected. What struck me first was not the emptiness or the silence, which I had tried to prepare myself for. It was the smell, or rather the absence of a particular smell. The smell of wood smoke and cooking and animals and people, that a living settlement carries the way a person carries their own warmth. Millhaven smelled of cold stone and creek water and nothing else. It smelled the way a place smells when it has been empty for a very long time. And it had been empty for 3 days. I walked to the Ames counter. The door was unlocked. The ledger was still open on the desk, the pen still resting across the page. I looked at the last entry Thomas Ames had made, a sale of lamp oil and 2 pounds of salt, dated the 8th of October. The handwriting was steady and ordinary. Nothing in it suggested distress or haste. I stood in that room for a long time, and the cold came up through the stone floor, and outside the empty village made no sound at all, and I understood for the first time in my life what it meant for a place to be truly gone. They came back 17 days apart, which is the detail that made everything harder rather than easier to understand. If they had returned together, or even within a day or 2 of each other, you could construct a simpler explanation. But 17 days is not a coincidence of timing. 17 days suggests different circumstances, different distances, different decisions. And that gap became one of the central puzzles that nobody ever fully resolved. The first to return was a man named Gerald Pitch, who had been one of Millhaven's less prominent residents, a quiet, unmarried laborer in his mid-30s who had worked occasionally at the Hale Mill and occasionally on neighboring farms, the kind of man a community relies on without quite noticing. He appeared at Caleb Storch's farm on the 26th of October on foot, arriving just after dark in a condition that Storch's wife later described as exhausted but coherent, not injured, not feverish, simply worn through, as if he had been walking for a very long time and had finally permitted himself to stop. Storch sent word to my father, and my father rode over the following morning, and several other neighboring men came as well. Gerald Pitch sat at Storch's kitchen table and answered questions with a directness that surprised everyone. He did not seem frightened of the questions. He did not seem to be concealing anything, or at least not obviously. But what he told them raised more questions than it answered, and some of what he said was difficult to accept at face value without corroboration. He said that Millhaven had left as a group, all of them, on the night of the 8th going into the 9th, the same night I had written my single-line journal entry about the absence of smoke and bells. He said the decision had been made quickly, within the space of a single evening's discussion among the heads of the village households, and that by midnight they were moving. He said they traveled northeast, following the ridge timber, away from Garrett's Crossing and away from the main roads. He said he had stayed with the group for 9 days before separating from them and making his way back alone, because he had decided, as he put it, that what the rest of them intended to do was not something he was willing to be part of. When pressed on what they intended to do, he was less forthcoming. He said only that Nathaniel Hale had made arrangements made over a period of months, quietly, involving land further north and west, beyond the reach of certain obligations he described without elaborating. He said the dispute that Caleb Storch had mentioned to my father, the argument between Hale and the Duggan brothers, had been the final pressure on a situation that had been building for considerably longer. He said that roughly 120 people had walked out of Millhaven that night, knowing where they were going and having chosen to go there. He said that 10 people had not gone willingly. That statement landed in Storch's kitchen, like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples from it have never entirely settled. Not in my mind, not in the 60 years since. My father pressed him immediately. Who were the 10, and what did not willingly mean in this context? Pitch said he did not know all their names with certainty. He knew that Thomas Ames had argued loudly against the plan in the final meeting, and had been, as Pitch described it, persuaded to reconsider. He knew that the schoolteacher Reese had not been given a choice in the matter at all, being an outsider whose knowledge of the plan was considered a liability. Beyond those two, he was either genuinely uncertain or had decided the specific names were not his to give. What not willingly meant, he would not specify beyond saying that no one had been physically harmed in the leaving. He said this with enough conviction that I believed him on that narrow point. But there is a considerable distance between not physically harmed and willing, and he knew it, and everyone in that kitchen knew it, and nobody pushed him further on it that morning in the way they perhaps should have. The second survivor appeared 17 days later, a woman named Clara Duggan, sister-in-law to the Duggan brothers, who arrived at a farmhouse near the Millhaven Road in the second week of November. She was in considerably worse physical condition than Pitch had been, not injured, but deeply worn, with the look of a person who had spent weeks outdoors in October weather with inadequate shelter. She was taken in by the farm family, rested for 2 days, and then spoke. Her account agreed with Pitch's on the basic facts: the group departure, the night of the 8th, the direction northeast, Nathaniel Hale's leadership of the whole undertaking. But on the question of the 10 unwilling ones, she said something that contradicted Pitch in one specific and unsettling way. She said the number was not 10. She said it was closer to 20. And she said that Thomas Ames had not merely argued against the plan and been persuaded. She said Thomas Ames had tried to leave the meeting and go to Garrett's Crossing that same night to raise an alarm and had been stopped. She said Priscilla had watched it happen. I was not present when Clara Dugan gave her account. I heard it third hand through my mother, through Harriet Vane. But when I heard that last sentence, when I heard that Priscilla had been there and had seen what was done to her father to prevent him from leaving, I sat down in the nearest chair and could not stand again for several minutes, because Priscilla had waved to me at the market 8 days before all of this. She had bought blue thread. She had laughed at something the vendor said. And 8 days later, she had watched something happen to her father that Clara Dugan would not describe in full. And then she had walked northeast into the timber with 100 and some number of people and had not come back. The authorities arrived in Garrett's Crossing on the 14th of November, which was 5 days after Clara Dugan had given her account and approximately 5 weeks after Millhaven had emptied. 2 men came from the county seat, a sheriff's deputy named Hargrove, and a second man whose official capacity was never made entirely clear to any of us, though he carried papers and asked questions with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to making problems smaller rather than larger. They stayed for 11 days. They interviewed my father, Caleb Storch, Aldous Vane, and several other neighboring men. They interviewed Gerald Pitch at considerable length. They attempted to interview Clara Dugan, but by the time they arrived, she had been moved to a relative's home further south, and the deputy made only one attempt to reach her before apparently deciding the effort was not worth the distance. They walked through Millhaven themselves, the 2 of them, on a gray November afternoon when the first real cold of the season had settled into the valley and the creek was running dark and low. My father accompanied them at their request. He said afterward that Hargrove was thorough and genuinely attentive, taking notes and examining each structure with care. The second man, whose name my father never learned with certainty, walked through the village more quickly and seemed less interested in what was there than in forming a conclusion he had apparently already begun to reach before arriving. On their last evening in Garrett's Crossing, Hargrove met with a small group of the neighboring farmers and gave them what he described as a preliminary assessment. He said the evidence was consistent with a voluntary mass departure. He said there was no physical evidence of crime at the scene, no evidence of violence, no evidence of unlawful detention, no bodies, no graves, no indication of anything that the law could act upon directly. He said the accounts of Gerald Pitch and, to the extent they had been relayed to him, Clara Dugan, were being treated as testimony in an ongoing inquiry. He said the county would make efforts to locate the group through contacts further north and west, through land registry offices and township records, and that if Nathaniel Hale had indeed made arrangements for land in that direction, there would eventually be a paper trail to follow. He said all of this carefully and without obvious evasion, and my father believed he meant it at the time. But the follow-up never came, or if it came in a form that never reached the people who had lived beside Millhaven and had known its inhabitants. No further investigators appeared. No results of any northern inquiry were communicated to Garrett's Crossing. The county, as far as anyone could determine, quietly folded the matter into a category of things that had been noted and set aside. The second man, the one with papers and no clear title, left Garrett's Crossing a day before Hargrove did. He had spent his last 2 days there meeting privately with several of the larger landowners in the area, including a man named Prescott who held considerable acreage to the north and east of the Millhaven Valley. What was discussed in those meetings nobody ever reported, but within 8 months of those conversations, the land on which Millhaven had stood, the valley, the mill site, the road, the 23 limestone houses, had passed into Prescott's ownership through a legal process that my father, who made inquiries, described as unusually swift and unusually clean for a property transfer involving land whose prior occupants had not formally relinquished title. That last detail is the one that, more than any other, convinced my father that the official response to Millhaven's disappearance had not been an honest one, not necessarily corrupt in the way that word is usually meant, not bribed or coerced, perhaps, but shaped, directed toward a conclusion that suited certain interests and away from questions that might have complicated those interests. What those interests were, I can only describe in the terms my father used and the terms I have since come to understand more fully. Millhaven sat on good valley land with water access and an existing mill. In the early 1850s, land of that description in western Pennsylvania was becoming valuable in ways it had not been a decade earlier. The expansion of rail lines, the growth of market towns, the pressure of increasing settlement from the east. A village that vanished without legal complication was, from a certain perspective, a convenient thing. I'm not saying the disappearance was engineered from outside. I do not believe that. Everything Gerald Pitch and Clara Dugan described pointed to a plan that came from within Millhaven itself, from Nathaniel Hale, and whatever combination of grievance and calculation had driven him to organize 130 people into walking away from everything they had built. The reasons behind that plan, the obligations Pitch had mentioned, the pressures that had been building for 2 years, I was only able to piece together partially over many years through fragments of information that came from different directions at different times. What I eventually came to believe was this: Nathaniel Hale had accumulated debts of a particular kind, not financial debts, or not only those, but legal entanglements connected to the mill's water rights and to an arrangement his father had made decades earlier with a land company that had since been absorbed into larger ownership. The specifics were complex and, by 1851, had become threatening enough that Hale believed the only solution was to disappear entirely, to take his community with him to land further north where those entanglements could not follow, where new arrangements could be made under different names in different jurisdictions. Whether all 130 people understood fully what they were participating in, I doubt. Whether the 20 who went unwillingly were ever given the choice to return, I do not know. Whether Priscilla Ames, with her red hair and her blue thread and her laugh that carried 3 houses, ever found any kind of peace in whatever place Nathaniel Hale led them to, that I have wondered about longer than I have wondered about almost anything else in my life. I am 82 years old, and I have had a long time to sit with what I know and what I will never know. Long enough that the two have stopped feeling like separate things and have become instead a single weight, familiar and permanent, the way an old scar stops hurting and simply becomes part of the skin. In the spring of 1859, 8 years after Millhaven emptied, a letter arrived at the Garrett's Crossing post office addressed to no one in particular, or rather addressed to the farming community of the surrounding valley, which amounts to the same thing. It had been posted from a township in northern Ohio, and it was written in a hand that the postmaster, who had known Millhaven, recognized as belonging to someone from that settlement, though he could not say with certainty whose. The letter was brief. It said that the people who had left were alive and settled. It said that those who had gone unwillingly had, for the most part, chosen to remain once they arrived and understood the situation more fully. It said that one person had not remained, had left the group sometime in the second year and gone in a direction unknown. It did not say which person. It offered no names, no specific location, no return address. My father read that letter at the kitchen table and sat with it for a long time before folding it and putting it in the tin box where he kept important papers. He said nothing about it for 3 days. Then one evening, he told my mother and me that he believed the letter was genuine and that it had been sent by someone who felt an obligation to let the outside world know that no graves needed to be dug, that the question of harm, at least in its most immediate form, could be set aside. He said he thought the letter was an act of conscience from someone who had carried the silence long enough and needed to release a portion of it without releasing all of it. I've thought about that letter more times than I can count. I have thought about the unnamed person who left the group in the second year and went in a direction unknown. I've spent decades wondering whether that person was Priscilla. I have no evidence either way. I have only the wondering, which has never stopped, and which I have long since accepted will not stop before I do. The one person who came close to giving me a direct answer was Clara Dugan, whom I finally met myself in the summer of 1863, 12 years after the disappearance, when she was living quietly in a town called Vanish, 3 counties away, and had built enough distance from her past to be willing to speak about it with someone who asked carefully and respectfully. I spent an afternoon with her in her kitchen, drinking tea that was too strong and listening to her fill in the parts of the story that had only reached me, filtered through other people's accounts. She confirmed everything I had already understood about the structure of what had happened. Hale's plan, the legal entanglements, the months of quiet preparation, the final meeting on the night of the 8th. She confirmed that Thomas Ames had been restrained when he tried to leave and raise an alarm. Restrained physically, held back by men following Hale's instruction, not hurt beyond the indignity and the fear of it, but held. She confirmed that Priscilla had been present and had seen it. And then she said something that has stayed with me more precisely than almost anything else in this account. She said that Priscilla had not been passive. She said that Priscilla had argued, had shouted, had positioned herself between her father and the men restraining him in a way that briefly stopped the whole proceeding. And she said that it was Nathaniel Hale himself who had spoken to Priscilla directly, quietly, in a voice Clara described as the most frightening she had ever heard. Not threatening, not raised, but utterly certain. He had explained to her in that quiet voice that her father would be released unharmed the moment the group was far enough along the road that his going to Garrett's Crossing could not stop what had already been set in motion. He said this as a promise, and he kept it. Thomas Ames was released near dawn, several miles northeast of Millhaven, and was told he was free to go back or continue forward. Clara said he stood in the road for a long time before walking forward. I left Clara Dugan's kitchen that afternoon with a fuller picture than I had ever had, and also with a grief that was different in character from the grief I had carried before. Because what Clara had described was not a story of pure victimhood or pure villainy. It was something more tangled and more human than either of those. Nathaniel Hale had done something that could not be defended, had taken people from their lives without genuine consent, had made decisions for an entire community that were not his alone to make. And yet, the community had, in its majority, gone with him knowingly and chosen to stay when they arrived, and Thomas Ames had stood in a road at dawn and chosen to walk forward into the unknown rather than back toward what he knew. People do not behave simply when the pressure is great enough. That is what Millhaven taught me. More than anything else, it taught me. I've never told this story publicly until now. There were years when I thought the silence was a kindness to the people who had left, to the families who had stayed behind and made their peace with not knowing. There were years when I thought the silence was simply easier than the alternative. I understand now that neither of those reasons was good enough. 130 people walked out of a valley one October night, and the world closed over the gap they left like water closing over a stone. And almost no one who came after knew that the gap had ever been there. That is the thing I cannot accept. Not the leaving, not even the manner of it, the forgetting, the way a place and all its people can simply cease to exist in the common memory, as if they never drew breath or ground grain or hung washing on a line in the morning light. Priscilla Ames bought blue thread at a market on a Saturday morning and waved at me from 2 stalls away, and 8 days later she was gone, and the world moved on without registering the loss. And I have spent 64 years refusing to let that be the end of the accounting. This is the accounting. It is late, and it is incomplete, and it is the best I can do. But it is done now, and perhaps that is enough.